Good morning and welcome to today's webinar where Agile projects need estimates too. We'll talk about estimating Agile projects using SEER for software. I'm David DeWitt, the Director of Software and IT Consulting. Most of you probably know that SEER for software supports many varieties of methodologies, waterfall, spiral, etc. But most of you may not know that SEER comes out of the box ready to support Agile development estimation. And while Agile is a relatively new methodology, the estimation principles are going to be the same. One of the comments we hear a lot is, we can't estimate this project because it's Agile. Well, the answer is, you can estimate any methodology in SEER. Every project needs an initial estimate, and Agile is not any different. Likewise, just because Agile projects work with sprints or fixed duration times, it doesn't mean that the estimate should not be performed. Within SEER, you can actually do sprint planning estimates using multiple team velocities, and this will help you identify the impact of backlogs on your next sprint. Backlog planning is re-estimation. So SEER comes out of the box ready with an array of tools to support Agile. Firstly are the Agile knowledge bases. These allow you to specify your team's experience. The tool also provides a story point sizing template. This will allow you to manage team experience using different team velocities. To address standard lifecycle schemas within the activity and labor naming schemas, you can customize these to reflect how your project will be performing, and also to describe the roles of your team members. And lastly is the ability to do user story management. Within SEER, you have the capability to actually load your user stories into a database and align them to your sprints. Within a parametric model, the SEER knowledge bases will drive the parameter settings for you. All you have to do is simply pick the best one that characterizes your team or the effort that you expect from your team. So to build an Agile, or in our case, a Scrum estimate, there's 4 simple steps. First, set up your environment. Second, you convert a velocity into an appropriate SEER volume measure. This is important if you're using a pointing schema. Third, determine how your estimate is going to be generated. Most everyone performs a traditional early estimate using analogies, but you may want to load the database with user stories or generate proxies for Scrum teams. And lastly, generate the estimate. Now you can build a top-down estimate for your total cost, effort, schedule, etc., or you could build a bottoms-up estimate and load it with sprints or user stories, whatever work needs to be performed. I do both. Let's talk about setting up the environment. When we want to identify our activity and labor naming schemas, we can simply go into the project parameters area and specify exactly what activity names or labor roles we want to use for the project. So instead of using a traditional software development lifecycle such as design, analysis, coding, testing, etc., we could substitute names like backlog planning, backlog selection, and identify the activities that are happening during our sprints. Likewise, with our labor categories, instead of having a traditional project manager and programmers, etc., we can call out product owners, scrum masters, designers, testers, release manager, whatever it is that you're using for your roles for your team. Now, within each sprint, we want to be able to accommodate what the actual labor distribution per activity will be, and this can be done on a sprint-by-sprint basis. For example, if you know that on an upcoming sprint, you're going to have a very low participation by a product owner, you might want to identify or modify those allocations. Now, these allocations are really easy to save into a class knowledge base, and this allows the customization to be applied for the model. Next, let's determine how our estimate's actually going to be generated. There's 2 common approaches for building an estimate for Agile. Traditionally, either user stories or story points. For user stories, what you can do is load your user stories into a SEER database to generate your estimate. This makes it really nice to do bottoms-up estimates using the user stories by aligning them to each sprint. This allows you to provide a one-to-one relationship between that user story and the sprint. However, you do need the database to be populated, and you'll have to maintain it. If you want to work with story points, You can designate a total story point per sprint, so you don't need a database. And your relationship to the user stories is abstracted. So this is nice from an estimator's perspective. They don't have to worry about what a user story is. You just give that the estimator a story point count, and they can use that to build the estimate. However, you do need to create a proxy to generate that story point to size relationship, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. Ideally, though, using story points, you can now accommodate risk ranges. Now, both these approaches can be combined. You might want to use story points for the high-level estimate, and then use user stories for your bottoms-up estimate or to load your sprints. However, this isn't limited to just user stories. In this webinar, we're focusing on user stories and story points because this is the primary mechanism in the Agile community. But you could just as easily use function points or use case points or any other volume collection approach that you may be using. The key, though, is to understand what velocity will be performed per sprint. Most of you know that the intent of Agile is to discover functionality. However, for the estimate, you need to know how fast can that functionality be delivered. And you choose your sizing approach around that characteristic for the velocity. So if you're using story points per sprint, that would be your velocity. But you could just easily be function points per sprint, use cases per sprint, even lines of code per sprint. So let's translate velocity into something that SEER can understand. So most Agile projects, we don't work with lines of code or function points. There's some other sizing metrics. They use feature points, story points, etc. We'll use story points. But these story points now need to be converted into something that SEER can understand. It's pretty simple to do this. The first thing you need to know is how much velocity is a team expecting to perform during a sprint, and how big is that sprint team going to be? How many team members will you have? So there's 3 simple steps. First, you define your knowledge base settings, set the platform, application, etc. Then you'll go into the SEER calibration design to size mode, enter the effort months per sprint. So if you were using a 4-person team and doing 1-month sprints, you would enter 4 effort months. The tool will then calculate an anticipated size in SEER size, and you'd simply divide that by your velocity to understand how much work can be done. So let's use a sample project. Let's assume we're building a fraud detection portal. It's a very simple application that monitors and tracks login IDs to a customer relationship management tool to help reduce fraud. So the first thing we do is we simply build our model and we set up all our knowledge bases. For the platform, we'll specify we're doing web-based development. This is going to be a customer relationship management application. We're going to be using generally new and some pre-existing code. For our development method, we're going to choose Agile Full. We have an experienced team. And for the development standard, we'll follow commercial best practices. So let's look at some of the assumptions. We're going to have an experienced Agile team, and they've already created 48 user stories, and they've done a story point count for each of those user stories. They plan the development to be done by a 4-person team, and they're going to want to do 1-month sprints and 3 sprints per release. And the team has told the estimator that they usually average 50 story points per sprint. So let's now create a size from that velocity. Within SEER, all you have to do, once you've built the knowledge base settings, built the program item, you turn on calibration mode, you enter the total effort months per sprint, and as we said, we're going to use a 4-person team. Then you enter a 1 into new lines of code. This toggles the lines of code as opposed to function points. In the calibration summary report, you'll see that it's going to identify what size is possible per sprint. In this example, the model states that we can assume 1,220 lines of code for that sprint team. This is what it looks like in the model. Again, we insert a 1 into the lines of code just so that we can toggle lines of code as opposed to function points. The last step then is dividing that size that's possible by the velocity of the team. So the SEER calculation, the SEER tool anticipates that 1,220 lines of code can be done during a sprint. The team says they can do 50 story points per sprint. So that tells us you have right about 24.4 lines of code per story point. This is what we want to accomplish, is understanding how many lines of code are related to the story points. So if we had a user story, and that user story was calculated to be 5 points, you simply multiply that times the lines of code. In this case, it gives us 122 lines of code for that user story. You can do this for each of your user stories. But remember, story points are arbitrary, and the relationship to the work is going to remain the same. So if one team may call the user story a 5, another one may have called it an 8. So story points are team dependent. So now that we have the size for story point, we can load a database and use the user stories individually, or we compare a proxy. Let's talk about modeling with the user stories first. The first thing we do is we identify all our user stories, and we designate a story, or we align the story point counts to each of the user stories. But that's done outside of SEER. The next thing we'll do is go through the exercise I just showed you, calculating the size of the story points by dividing the lines of code by how much velocity. Okay. Now this data then gets saved into the SEER historical database. But a reminder, this will work for use cases or functions or requirements, whatever it is that you're using as your input mechanism for the work that has to be performed. So then to generate a top-down estimate, we simply have to generate our work element in SEER using all the appropriate knowledge bases. Then under the estimate menu option, we select analogy-based sizing. This goes out and reads the database with all our user stories. Then we simply select all of our user stories from the pop-up dialog box. We choose sum for our computation method, and you'll notice that we get a full size estimate for all of the user stories, and we click the apply button. Voila, you have an estimate. It really is that simple. Now, if you want to generate a bottoms-up estimate from user stories, everything's done the same way. However, you'll need to lay out your releases in sprints. Now, you can do this manually, or if you have a scenario, you simply run your scenario and pick the sprints that are applicable for this project. Then you populate each of those sprints from the user stories. You do it the same way as we just showed you. However, this time, instead of choosing all the user stories, you go through and pick out the user stories that are specified to be performed during that sprint. The advantage here is you can instantly see if that total story point count, or that user stories, excuse me, will fit into that sprint. Now let's talk about modeling with story points. But before we do that, we have to talk about proxies for a moment. In SEER, proxies capture how we describe the work we want to perform. Generally speaking, if you have something that you can't put your arms around as far as lines of code or function points, but you can describe the effort associated with it, you can build a proxy to create that relationship. And all proxies work the same. So if we're working with use cases or workflows or facts and dimensions tables or queries, whatever it might be, if you can describe the effort to complete one of something, you can use the proxy builder tool. So the process is identify the effort associated with building that one of something, set up the project characteristics within the tool, then you launch the SEER proxy builder tool, and it'll help generate the relationship between that one of something and how many lines of code or function points that will take. In our world, for this estimate, a story point is going to be our one of something. So let's look at the sizing from story points. So the first two steps remain the same. You identify your user stories, and you have them pointed. That's done outside of SEER. You calculate your size, your velocity, and the size relationship. But this time, instead of assigning the sizing information to the user stories, what we're going to do is we're going to generate a story point proxy that allows us to use that velocity measure. Again, this will work for use cases or workflows, anything that you can describe using effort. So let's show an example of how to use a story point proxy. Within SEER, we've already provided an initial example for you. It's a very simple scale that we've provided. However, you're going to need to tune that proxy to whatever your own team scale is going to be and your team velocity. It's provided just as an example. The SEER proxy builder, though, will create relationships that allow the estimator to not have to worry about these underlying factors. It becomes transparent in the model. We'll show you how this works. So within the proxy builder, you create a relationship between the work you're doing and the SEER size. So you'll simply launch the proxy sizing dialog box from the Tools menu. You click the New button. You give the proxy a name. Give it a file name so it can be saved. Then you lay out what your input scale is going to be. This is how you would describe the work that you're performing. Or in this case, we're describing the size of our story points. You apply the sizing factors, and then you click Save. Currently, these sizing factors have to be done outside of SEER, but coming soon, we'll have automatic factoring. Now that we have the story point built, the proxy built, we have to use the proxy. So the way a proxy is used is one of the sizing approaches. Now, SEER has 3 different sizing areas: lines of code, function points, and proxy sizing. This is where we'll use the proxy that we just built. You simply select the proxy description, and then from the pull-down dialog box that appears, you select the proxy that you want to use. In this case, we want to use our story points for Team A. This will bring up another input screen for you to input your estimate. Okay. This is going to allow you to specify how many of each of those somethings you want to be in your estimate. In our case, we're talking about user stories that are weighted with certain story point values. The nice feature here is that you can also enter a least likely and most range for the story points. So if, for example, we have 10 user stories that are 5s, we can enter a 10 across the line. But we also might say, for this sprint, we think we can do 10 of them. Maybe we could do 12, or maybe we could only do 8. We'll be able to specify that. Now, my scaling schema that I was used, I borrowed from Mike Cohen. This is a very simple scaling methodology to use. So let's use a real example. If I have a collection of user stories, and they've been counted, so I have 2 user stories that have a weight of 3, 3 user stories that have a weight of 5, and 2 user stories have a weight of 8. In the tool, I simply double-click on my stories of 3 points. I enter a 2, least likely and most. For 5, I enter a 3, least likely and most. And for my user stories at the weight of 8, I enter 2, least likely and most. However, the team may think that there's a chance they could actually get 3 3-pointers in during this sprint. So we could show this risk range. Likewise, they may say that we may only be able to get 1 of the 8s done. So we can state that at a minimum we can get 1 done. We're hoping to get 2 done. This is accommodating the risk in the estimate. So let's recap by revisiting the model. You can generate high-level estimates to ask the questions. It's no different working in an agile environment or any other methodology. But within the agile world, we can now, by generating a high-level estimate, we can identify how many releases or sprints are going to be needed for the whole life cycle of the project. But we can also identify what the total cost, effort, schedule, et cetera, is going to be for the whole project. And we let the SEER Agile knowledge bases drive the parametric values for us. So nothing's really changed. You still need a rough order understanding of the size to build that initial estimate, either done by analogies or comparison to other projects or a list of features or user stories. But when you're ready to generate a detailed sprint estimate, it's very simple to break that model down into multiple releases or multiple sprints. Then you allocate the size to those sprints by the user stories or the story points. This is going to allow you to manage your sprints in great detail. And it's very easy to separate these sprints into multiple teams. So let's wrap up. Within SEER, there are specific parameters that you need to consider when working with agile estimates. But you should let the knowledge bases address these parameters for you. You may want to go back and revisit them to identify any project-specific characteristics that may drive one of the parameters to be outside of what the knowledge base settings specified. So for formal estimation process, formal estimation process is appropriate for agile projects. but it's always best to build your estimate with the best information available. And you can expect your estimates at feasibility and concept phases to be full estimates. You don't decompose them into sprints until later. So when you're building that first estimate, if you already have user stories available, then use them. But you may be building your initial estimates using epics or analogies to other projects. Once you start building proxies to accommodate different velocities, you'll be able to plug those in to your sprints. And user stories are a great way to build those bottom-up estimates. So it's okay to assume an agile development methodology, but remember when you're building the estimate, you may need to accommodate the maturity of your team, the availability of subject matter experts, do you have a scrum master available, et cetera. And you'll do that by going in and modifying some of the specific parameters that are associated with those. But initially, you want to let the knowledge base account for those uncertainties. So in closing, this was a quick presentation of the overview of the features that are already available inside Sierra software to generate agile estimates. And certainly, we didn't cover all the nuances of generating the estimate, but there are numerous other tips we may want to consider. So we provide a one-day hands-on workshop on how to build agile estimates in Sierra software. So thank you for your time and attention today, and feel free to contact us with any questions. info@gallerat.com or visit us at www.gallerat.com. Thank you.